What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown. This is Heresy Financial. Demographic trends are arguably one of, if not the most important statistic in looking at economic growth. And that's because of the tight correlation that population trends have with economic trends. And it's also because some of the same reasons behind those economic trends are also behind the demographic trends. So because of this, it's a good idea to pay attention to what's happening to a country's population if you want an idea of what the economy is going to be doing in the future as well. And unfortunately, the population in the United States possibly just peaked in 2021. And the trends are showing that we are turning the corner into a declining population from here on out. So in this video, we are going to look at why and what can be done. Ready? Let's dive in. Okay, first let's get something out of the way. There are still an unbelievable number of people out there who believe the 60-year-old lie that's been disproven many times over that the world is overpopulated. It is far from overpopulated. Not only is it not overpopulated right now, we are never ever going to get there. Global population is going to top out in the next 100 years at around 11 billion people. And there's plenty of space and there are plenty of resources for that. And we don't have time to get into all of that during this video, so if you don't believe me, try reading a book. So while we are very far away from there not being enough resources for the population on Earth, the problem is actually the reverse. Many countries just don't have enough people. But as with many things, the problem is a little bit more nuanced than that. The problem comes down to the productive capacity of a nation. Because when you look at an individual, you basically do two things economically speaking. You're going to produce and you're going to consume. Now, there are many people that produce more than they consume, and there are many other people that consume more than they produce. For instance, take children. For the first couple of decades of their life, all they do is consume. Now, that's an investment in the future, right? Because that child will eventually be able to produce more than they're consuming, but for at least the first 2 decades, they're basically going to be a net consumer of resources. Likewise, senior citizens. At a certain age, you've gotten past the point at which you can be more productive than what you consume. This means that the middle range of a population must produce enough to support the consumption of the entire population. Now, this sounds like it shouldn't be a problem, and historically in the United States, it hasn't been. But it does become a problem when the middle productive age range has fewer people in it than the unproductive top. Said bluntly, this happens when the total number of old people significantly outweigh the total number of young people. Now, in order to project into the future, see if any of these things are going to be a problem, the first thing we have to look at is the birth rate. If the birth rate is 2.1 per woman, that means the population will be stable over time, right? Because if every woman has 2.1 children throughout her entire lifetime, that means that the population will have enough kids to replace itself. Now, technically that number is 2, so you have to get a little bit above 2 to account for infant mortality and things like that. So anything higher than 2.1 will lead to a growing population. Anything lower than 2.1 will lead to a declining population. But there's even further nuance than just that. We have to dive in a little bit deeper because the age in which somebody decides to have kids actually matters a lot too. So imagine we have a constant birth rate of 2.1. That means that we are constantly having enough kids. Every person is having enough kids in order to sustain the population. Now with population A with a 2.1 birth rate, let's say that they have kids in their late teens and early 20s. Generation after generation, right around 20 years old, that's when everybody has their kids. Well, over the course of time then, assuming an average lifespan of let's say 80 years old, you will have 5 generations alive at the same time. Now let's say you take that population A and you start to change when they have their kids from their 20s to their 40s. Eventually you get to the point where if you're having kids in your 40s, you only have 3 generations alive at the same time. So even with a constant birth rate, with the replacement level of 2.1, you can still have a declining population if the average age of childbirth starts to increase. So with that in mind, how do those two stats look in the United States? Birth rate and average age of childbirth. childbirth. Well, not good. The total fertility rate hit a new low in 2020 of 1.6. Remember, we need 2.1 to just sustain, to just replace the number of people who are dying. And in 2020, we hit a new low of 1.6. But this isn't even an outlier. In fact, the general trend since the 60s has been on the decline. Not only that, but the birth rate in the United States has been below the replacement threshold for decades. And not only is the birth rate too low, but the average age of having children has been rising. If you look at this chart, you can see that for many countries, including the US, which I have outlined in red, the average age of childbirth has been rising. Not for everybody, but on average. In the United States, the black dot is the 70s, the white dot is the year 2000, and the blue bar represents 2019. So you can see here that the average age in which people are having children since the 70s has been increasing. Remember, again, this means even if you have a constant birth rate at the replacement level of 2.1, you will still have a declining population if the average age of childbirth continues to increase. The older generations simply start dying off before the new generations are born. So with both of these statistics so severely working against us, you might imagine that our population would have imploded long ago, but it hasn't. So what has our population actually been doing? Well, surprisingly, it is still growing, which begs the question, how? Well, in one word, immigration. Without immigrants, the United States population would have imploded long ago. We would have nowhere near the working age population necessary to support the consumption of our entire population. But unfortunately, it looks like immigrants may not continue to pick up the slack into the future. If you look at this chart, you can see that the net population growth has been declining in the United States for decades and recently has been falling off of a cliff. In fact, this year in 2021, in total, the United States population grew by less than ever before in the entire history of our country. Our net population growth was only 0.1%. In other words, when you add up all of the babies born and all of the immigrants who moved here and then subtract everybody who moved away and everybody who died, our population only increased on net by 0.1%. And the biggest changes that have happened over the last few years that have resulted in such a shocking decline in our rate of increase in population has been due to changes in immigration. In fact, the net international migration number for the United States from 2020 to 2021 was only 247,000 people. So we are having fewer babies at older ages and we are welcoming fewer immigrants to our nation. These three facts added up to a population that only increased by 0.1% in the last year, which again is the lowest on record. And the fact that this is not an outlier, it is just the next data point in a long and strong trend of rapidly declining population growth numbers, means that in 2022, the United States population could very well shrink for the first time in history. So why is this happening? Well, number one, there's a general idea out there that it is bad to have kids. This is an anti-human ideology. There is nothing more rewarding in life than having kids and creating a family. Number two, there's an idea that you have to wait until you get rich or until you've made it or until a lot of things are in line in order to have kids. And I can tell you from personal experience that having kids makes you grow up. And if you're waiting until things in your life fall in line before you start a family, you're going to be waiting a lot longer for those things to happen than they would if you would have kids first. There is nothing like the responsibility of another life on your hands that makes you get your shit in order. And regarding why immigration is falling off a cliff, I would boil it down to one word: freedom. Why has the United States always been the most attractive place on earth to move to? Freedom. Everyone who has failed collapsing communist regimes, dictatorships, failed utopias, famine and starvation, they come to America because it is the best and easiest place where you can stand up on your own 2 feet. You can start a business easily. If you work hard, you get to keep the rewards of your labor. Opportunities are everywhere because as long as you open your eyes and you can see a need, you can choose to fill it. And think for a second about the stereotypes of immigrants regardless of where they've come from. They're the hardest workers. They're business owners. They're highly educated. They're extremely entrepreneurial. Put simply, the freedom and the United States has attracted the best people from all around the world for decades. But quite frankly, that is changing, and very soon may no longer be the case. It is getting harder and harder to come to the United States, not easier, at a time when we need immigrants more than ever. And it is becoming less and less attractive to the people, the very people that we want to attract. It is becoming less and less free. It is becoming more difficult to start a business as government-sanctioned monopolies use increased regulation and bailouts in order to squeeze small competition out of business. More and more laws make it more difficult to innovate. Higher tax and inflation burdens from an ever-expanding government. And as you probably can see by now, the very same things that are causing our population to turn a corner into declining for the first time in history are the very same things that are starting to suffocate our economy. And as we have an aging population that is leaving the workforce, this is exactly the time we would not want to be turning away the best people in the world. So what can be done about it? Well, number one, have kids. Like I said, that's the best decision you will ever make in your life. Second, study demographics of different countries and invest in places where the demographics support long-term growth. And third, get a backup plan in place. Because quite frankly, when a place turns from being somewhere that people want to go to being somewhere that people want to leave, it can very quickly get very difficult to leave. And number four, spread the word. Share this video with somebody you think it would be helpful for as well. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thank you for watching.